Vitaly Shapran has already joined us, a member of the Ukrainian Society of Financial Analysts and a member of the NBU Council in 2019 and 2021. We welcome you to the Freedom Broadcast.
Good evening.
Hello. Hello.
Vitaly, tell me, how is it that Iran, on the one hand, is eyeing Russian missiles because it thinks it needs to somehow defend itself from the United States of America? But on the other hand, it understands that Russia is now its strongest competitor in the fight for the Chinese market. What do you think will prevail in this situation?
I think this is standard behavior for two members of a very dysfunctional family. And in this argument, greed will always win. In other words, there can't be any other scenario here. So basically, if you look at all these processes, if you look at the history of relations between OPEC countries, starting from the 1970s with the crisis, then in 1978 to 79 on the oil market, and the last crisis when the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, the scenario is always the same. Then it's the same regimes that are used to living off oil eventually have to, but over time, after a couple of years, they are forced to increase production, lower the price risk, even bypassing OPEC agreements, with the justification that someone is at war, someone else has had a revolution start, like in Iran, unrest, and so on. The explanation is simple. They really want to eat. That is, some of them really do need to feed their population, which is hungry. Like in Iran, there is a food problem, and it's a serious one. Relations with the Afghan authorities are very strained. They are essentially looting Iran's food markets from the north and taking advantage of the large subsidies that the Iranian government provides for food. And as for Russia, it needs to wage war. So these two trends will shape, or let's say will program, the competition in the so-called black oil market. On the black market for oil, for sanctioned oil, I think they will continue to drive events indefinitely. That is, until they change their policies, until Russia ends the war and Iran stops oppressing its own people and initiates some semblance of democratic processes for which they are being offered universities, I think we will continue to see this competition. And to a large extent, this is happening right now. Indeed, as you correctly noted, thanks to India, thanks to the fact that India has limited its participation in the market for this cheap but blood-stained oil. And this situation, as long as India stays away from this market, I think will continue for a very long time. That's it.
Still, people say indeed that India is like, I don't know, the little engine that sets this process in motion. According to analysts, India's imports from Russia could drop by 40% from the January level. So what about the global figures, actually? The Russian Urals brand is selling at about $12 per barrel cheaper than the same benchmark. Meanwhile, Iranian light, according to analysts, is currently trading at an $11 discount to the global benchmark. And what will happen next? What does your professional intuition tell you?
Well, let's start with the figures cited by Bloomberg. I don't agree with them because the official figure, which I also question, but it's the figure from Russia's Ministry of Economy, shows that in January the tax price for oil, which is a blend of 78% Urals, and the rest is made up of ESPO, which is more expensive and cost about $41. So there's no talk of any discount there. There never was, isn't, and won't be any $10 to $12 discount. And on top of that, the Russians were played a cruel trick. Their longtime and reliable allies are the biting winter frosts, which have now completely covered the entire Leningrad region and the city of St. Petersburg. Consequently, during this past week, the tanker shipping rates in that specific area rose quite sharply. This occurred because, quite simply, the available supply of specialized freight tankers operating in the Gulf of Finland dropped significantly. Not because there aren't any tankers, they actually have them, but because there aren't enough icebreakers and divers to guide these tankers out of the ports. And practically there, the shipping rates have almost doubled. I think we'll get the exact numbers next week, but you should have a rough idea of what they're selling at. Urals is now averaging about $35 per barrel. And on average, they pay between $10.50 and $14.50 for oil transportation. The most expensive route remains the one to India. This is one of the reasons why it's not very profitable for them to sell there right now. But even with this ratio, when they have to pay more than a third of the price just for transportation, they're still trying to fight for this market. Precisely because of the long distance and because of these harsh freezing conditions in the Gulf of Finland, they are currently unable to do it. Well, as for India, you see the situation is, like you mentioned, a small lever, but believe me, India is a very large buyer, a serious global player with a population in the billions, and just like China, it is interested in diversifying its supply sources. Why isn't China now trying to buy everything exclusively from Russia? Because they have a national doctrine, they are also a major player, a global one, and they set themselves the goal of maintaining precisely a diversification of supplies. This is very important for them because they do not want to become dependent on Russia the way the European Union was. They saw firsthand what comes of that, and their security is above all else. That's why. Iranian oil, and I even think that Saudi oil as well, will be in demand in the near future. And all the oil that Vladimir Putin wants to sell to China, China definitely will not buy all of it. There might be some fluctuations in supply, but in this dispute, India's position, not only guided by its internal interests, but also the trade pressure from the United States, has turned out to be quite effective. I think that without such trade pressure from the EU and the softer but still present sanctions pressure from the European Union, we wouldn't be seeing the situation that we are witnessing now. But as for the numbers, I would address my colleagues who also recite them. They actively use Bloomberg data, specifically regarding prices for Urals and ESPO. I would urge you to take a closer look because the January prices we've seen in official sources are significantly lower. And as far as I understand, the discount to the current Brent is now not even around $15, but $25. That's why the stated discount rates of $12 to $15 seem far too low to me.
Vitali, it's interesting to look into this. Both Iran and Russia are now competing for China as an oil buyer. But this is really just a kind of lifeline, but it's hardly a long-term solution. Because this might be a temporary solution, since China is not able to absorb the amount of oil that both countries would need to sell. This doesn't look like a long-term solution to the problem. It's an emergency measure in a situation of low demand. Even if one of the countries somehow manages to secure a priority for itself, which is hard to imagine because this whole rivalry is very advantageous for China, it would hardly save one side for long, any one of the sides.
In principle, I agree with you, but I want to respond with an example. Since August of last year, China has been buying liquefied gas from Russia in volumes that exceed its own needs. And with great success, it resells this gas to Taiwan, Bangladesh, and even to South. I want to emphasize South Korea. This is official statistics, which are available in customs databases, Russian, foreign, and Chinese alike. No one has been hiding this for a long time, so re-export is possible. But again, these deals are isolated cases. So you are absolutely right. How long can they keep living like this? They won't be able to, and I very much doubt that China will buy for political reasons, sacrificing its own energy security. Everything that Russia wants to sell to it, unless Russia offers extremely attractive prices for oil. But then what? Will they sell it for $20 to $25? For them, that's not profitable right now.
Vitali, but what can really be done about this? About this fleet of tankers drifting around the world's oceans, unable to find a place to dock, and that wonderful berth where they could have unloaded. What is the economic solution in this situation? Because from a layperson's perspective, there seems to be virtually no way out.
I want to congratulate you. You're practically a professional already. I think even the professionals have the same impression, because you see, the problem with the tankers isn't that they've been loaded and can't be unloaded. But the problem is that in the global market, an artificial situation has been created, including thanks to the United States, the European Union, and Ukraine, where Russia is forced to use the global tanker fleet, including the shadow fleet, and not just the ones they own, but also independent carriers who take on these risky voyages simply to store oil there. As I mentioned in the previous broadcast, Russia's oil storage facilities are enough for 8 to 12 days of operation in the oil industry. Otherwise, they would have to stop or drastically reduce production, which is very expensive. And now when tankers are fully loaded, when tanker shipping rates are very high, they're rising not only because of Ukrainian strikes, but also because if all the tankers are full and there are no new tankers or people willing to make trips for Russia, then the price for freight will go up. That's all there is to it. And that's exactly what we're witnessing right now. What worries me, of course, is that the price compared to December has risen from $39 to almost $41. This is specifically the tax price of Russian oil, from which the resource tax is calculated. There is some tendency toward price increases, but it's very weak. It could be related to certain climatic or seasonal factors. But based on the information coming to the market, we are literally on the verge. A collapse in the price of Russian oil to levels significantly below $41 because indeed tankers are full and they need to be unloaded somewhere, and in order to free them up, very large discounts have to be offered accordingly. It is my firm belief and professional assessment that if the United States and the European Union do not decide to relax or mitigate their current economic sanctions and trade pressure, while maintaining the same intense and serious pace as we saw in December and January, then in the next perhaps 2 weeks, we could potentially see a substantial and very noticeable decrease in the market price of crude oil originating from Russia, and most likely this will also affect the tax price calculated by their Ministry of Economy.
You know, I want to talk to you about tankers. It's not an obvious factor, although in principle it is quite clear. All the tankers in Russia's shadow fleet are very old. And why was it advantageous for Russia at some point to buy already old, maybe even decommissioned tankers? That's understandable because in general the budget is probably limited right now. For example, India and China are hardly likely to dare to sell newer tankers to Russia in circumvention of sanctions because secondary sanctions, one way or another, still scare them. But again, this strategy seems temporary because these tankers break down more often and are more prone to accidents. How much can this factor actually affect the shadow fleet and the situation with the sale of Russian oil?
You're asking a very complex question during a limited broadcast. I will certainly try to answer that by highlighting the main points. I have carefully calculated the potential profitability of purchasing an older oil tanker specifically for major Russian oil companies during the year 2024. At the rates that were in place, transportation cost about $7 to $8. Now it's higher. And for an old tanker to break even, it only needed to make about 5 to 7 trips. That's not a lot, especially considering that before the European Union sanctions, let's say on a single voyage, they would make 2 trips. They would take Russian oil to India and then from India bring to Europe fuel produced from Russian oil at Indian refineries. When that prosperous period of peak success finally came to an end, it follows quite naturally that their payback period began to lengthen significantly. I think they still have no more than 10 trips in total, at least according to several specific evaluation criteria. That's why we saw that both Russian Rosneft and Lukoil were buying directly for themselves. They registered Russian tankers under their names. They put them on their own balance sheets, hid them later, yes, and there was even, I think, a Financial Times investigation about a deal involving 25 tankers, where they tracked exactly which shell companies were involved and so on. So the main problem is for us to find these tankers, to identify them, to determine that they are specifically Russian, that they belong directly to Russian companies, because it is precisely these tankers that oil shipments rely on, and we can see that this process is gradually unfolding. If you noticed, Ukraine struck at empty tankers, I emphasize, without oil on board. Yes, they were put out of commission, sank, ran aground, and so on, which really cooled down the shipping market. But when several tankers are taken out of operation, either through Ukraine's actions, as has happened, or through the actions of the United States, which detained these tankers, then of course this oil traffic is interrupted and it's difficult for them to restore it. As for independent carriers, such as, for example, Greek tankers, they were involved, yes, and were repeatedly spotted making trips in Russia's interests. The situation here is twofold because, they're charging a lot. The tariff is $15 per barrel, while the oil is being sold for just over $30 to India, so that's giving away half the price for transporting oil per barrel. On the one hand, they're making money, and you could wag your finger at them and say, what are you doing? You're feeding Russia. But on the other hand, they're taking a significant slice of the pie away from that country. And it's kind of like an unofficial tax on freight. And we see that indeed it is a complex, multifaceted situation. It would have been entirely possible to effectively bring a definitive conclusion to Russia's whole party with the old fleet, simply by implementing much stricter regulations on their maritime insurance requirements. Specifically, the presence of insurance for the tankers themselves, because there is no quality insurance, no proper insurance coverage. Let's recall what happens when it comes to insurance payouts. In the Kerch Strait, with the fuel oil spill, the Russian authorities still cannot recover compensation from the shipping company, even though the damage was done. Mainly their domestic market, mainly the coastline, 120 kilometers of the Anapa coast. They can't even manage to secure this compensation for environmental damage within their own country. Imagine what a terrible situation it would be if, for natural reasons, as you rightly said, the tankers are very old and the likelihood of an accident there is very high. And suddenly, if a large tanker carrying a huge amount of oil or fuel oil has an accident and there is a spill near, for example, the beautiful Turkish, Spanish, Greek, or even Italian coast, these losses would be incomparable to the total book value of the entire fleet, including the official Russian fleet, including the commercial fleet, not just the tankers. So what are these companies which are now issuing policies left and right going to pay for these shadow tankers flying the Panamanian flag and so on? So these things, this isn't even a question for Ukraine. It's a matter of global environmental safety.
That's true.
Vitaly, thank you so much for finding the time to join us live today. Vitaly Shaprov,